Welcome to Myth and the Search for Meaning. Today we are reading a biography of the Greek philosopher Diogenes of Sinope.
I'm Aaron.
And I'm Nate. So, a little bit about how we met. You and I went to college together for about, a year and a half, would you say?
Yeah. Well,
It depends on how you count, because there's the
it
pandemic.
depends.
So,
Well, I wasn't at college for the pandemic year.
well, yeah, but you hadn't withdrawn from the college during a lot of there was a long period where we both intended to go back to the same college.
Yeah.
So neither of us did. We met in an undergraduate philosophy program.
Yep.
I got a degree in creative writing.
I got a degree in computer science.
Yeah.
Betrayed the love
I
of
definitely think
wisdom.
you came out on top out of the two of us for sure.
Well, we'll
when it
see
comes
how
to
things go with AI.
subsequent academic careers. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about your career outside of academia?
Yeah, I play music. I've been in a few bands over the past few years. Third Street String Band, the Mudchuckers, just in local little bands. I write some songs. Hopefully, I have a couple things on SoundCloud under AJ Potter Music, but hopefully, I'll have some actual music release soon. But yeah.
And you have an Instagram, right? It's like Aaron Potter
Oh yeah,
Sings. AJ Potter Music, yeah. It's fascinating to me that you didn't mention the band Earth Tones, because it's your only band whose name I know.
Yeah.
But apparently they don't get a shout out.
Well, I'm more of a regular guest.
You wouldn't consider yourself in the band.
No.
Okay,
I've been away
fair
for
enough.
too long for its existence.
So I am a library assistant. It's different from a librarian. I do a lot of the stuff that you would imagine a librarian doing. I recommend books to people, create library displays, help people check things in and out of the library. The difference is mainly that I don't have to do any data science. So, a librarian proper would be analyzing, here's how many books got checked out from this subject, and here's how long they were checked out. So, this is how many we need to meet demand next year, and all of these calculations. I don't mess with numbers like that. I'm also a writer. My writing has appeared in L'Esprit Literary Review, Gray Matter, a creative collection, and Wild Sound. Links to all of that and to all of Aaron's social media in the episode description. So I do want to get to Diogenes, but first, I assume most of the people listening to this came from Tumblr. If you know my Tumblr blog, you almost certainly have heard something that Aaron said. Aaron, what is that something?
That I'm working out so I don't become lost in the world of signs and forget the things they signify.
Yeah, there was a viral post on Tumblr that I made maybe 3 or 4 years ago that's just describing Aaron. And later it got 2 million views on Twitter or something like that.
Yep, that was I saw it after a long time and that was very surreal.
Neither of us were aware. It's not we saw it going from one interaction on Twitter. I don't know what you guys call notes. What's a note on Twitter?
They call
a like?
I
What they call them? What?
So I'm not really
Well, whatever. It's not like we saw it go from 1 to 1,000 to 100,000. We just found out one day that it was over 2 million.
Yep.
But I was hoping you could read the post in question. It's just in the
Oh no.
outline. Can you read it out loud for us, please? I will do anything, Aaron.
All right. Huge shout out to my friend from an undergraduate philosophy program who started working out every single day, not for health benefits or to become conventionally attractive or whatever, but because, and this is a direct quote, he was concerned that otherwise he might become lost in the world of signs and forget the things they signify. I have thought about this every single time that I've worked out since.
Incredible stuff from an incredible guy. So I want to briefly talk about what this podcast is. So it's going to be a book club format where we discuss sometimes a full novel, sometimes a short story. We've got some poetry in the mix. We will tell you what is being read for next episode at the end of this episode, and then we just kind of have a discussion about it. I want to say off the bat that we are not doing like a comprehensive guide. We are talking about the book, and we will try to make it accessible for people who haven't read it, but like you're going to get more out of this podcast if you do read it. And I definitely don't think you should like enter a discussion on Diogenes being like, I listened to these two morons on a podcast, so I get it now. Let me go talk to a classicist.
One moron.
You know? Does that make sense? Which one of us is the moron?
That's for you to decide.
Only God knows. And I also want to say, like, I think a lot of criticism, especially of older texts, takes the form of something I call like a moral catalog, which is just like where you make a spreadsheet of every single bad thing that happens or is said. We're not going to do that. Tons and tons of bad things happen in ancient Greek writing. We're not going to sit down and list them one by one. We know that they are bad, but I'm not going to devote time to like creating a comprehensive guide to every single moral wrong in a book written hundreds of years ago, you know?
How much would someone have to pay you to do that if they were just curious?
Oh, like $20. Like
$20.
I am ready for commissions, but commission me first.
That's a crazy low price. I feel like that's a long job.
I feel like I could do it off the top of my head, just like with my eyes closed.
Well, you heard it here first. $20 if you want to hear the moral catalog.
So we read a part of a book called The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. This is a book that has biographical sketches of many Greek philosophers, which was written by Diogenes Laertius. Now, to be clear, Diogenes and Diogenes Laertius are different guys. We are talking about the parts of the book by Diogenes Laertius that are about Diogenes of Sinope. Aaron, will this be confusing?
No, not at all. It's very, very clear and easy to remember. But just in case it will, I propose we start saying, instead of Diogenes Laertius, the big DL.
I am down for that, actually. But first, I want you to pretend that I am like an 18-year-old freshman on the first day of Phil 101. And like maybe I got good grades in high school, but like I've never read a word of Plato. What is philosophy?
In some ways, I think the best is just the Greek description, love of wisdom, and, leave it at that, because it really does change over time. I don't really think there's any particularly like proper method or subject matter of philosophy that can distinguish it in every or even most case from other fields of study. To some extent, I think it's mostly just an artifact of how a culture carves up its ideas, and philosophy sort of ends up being the miscellaneous box of abstract thought.
I really like the definition of philosophy that I saw on Wikipedia when I last went to their page for it, which is that philosophy is the practice of asking extremely general questions. So, an economist might ask the question, is it good for suburban families if we execute such and such policy? And a philosopher would ask, well, what is goodness? Or an artist might ask, is it more beautiful if I contrast these two different types of colors, or if I use one color in a very particular pattern? The philosopher would ask, what is beauty? How do you feel about that definition?
That's not a bad, first attempt. Although I would say it probably, although this isn't necessarily a bad thing, privileges the, sort of Platonic inheritance.
I would say it's a great definition for an 18-year-old on their very first day of Phil 101. And by the time that 18-year-old is like a senior doing 400 level classes in the field of philosophy, they will disagree with it. But it is good enough for the 18-year-old.
This is why I don't teach Philosophy 101.
And with that, So, philosophy flourished during a period in ancient Athens called the Athenian Golden Age. And I just want to point something out, which is I feel like a lot of people think of philosophy as like the Greek thing. But philosophy was, in my mind, more like Woodstock. I think of 60s culture as Woodstock, but during the 1960s, Woodstock was like deeply counterculture. And like in the Athenian Golden Age, philosophy was like tearing down all of these well established, widely accepted beliefs. Does that seem fair?
I mean, this is sort of the nature of countercultures that it's often, it's not necessarily that it's, marginal and was sort of operating in the same, marketplace as, all these other, religious and, the mystical, schools and stuff. Similarly, the way that, like, the music at Woodstock was also popular music at the time, which doesn't necessarily counteract the point, just, complexifies it, I guess.
Let's talk about some philosophers that people might be familiar with, either through like high school or like The Good Place or just general knowledge. Who is Socrates in one sentence?
Sort of the icon of ancient Greek philosophy.
Yeah, I'm trying to come up with like a music example. I don't really know musical history well enough. It's like what Stephen Sondheim, maybe? I don't really know if this is
No,
true,
that's
but
probably
like no.
not a good
No?
example.
Okay.
No,
What
no,
would be
no
a good
insult meant to
example?
Sondheim. I would say if we're keeping the 60s music analogy, then Socrates is like, the Elvis.
I'm sorry, I could not name an Elvis song with like a gun to my head, but Socrates was the
Wow.
Elvis, everybody. I would say Socrates, there were philosophers before him, but he was maybe the first of the philosophers that we still care about today, unless you're like a Greek historian or is like really getting into the nitty gritty. Socrates is like the first of the philosophers from ancient Greece that you learn about in high school. He didn't leave any writing behind of his own, at least not that we found, but he took a variety of students, including Plato. One sentence. Who is Plato?
I almost want to be cheeky and say the inventor of Socrates.
Yeah, yeah. So we don't really know the things that Socrates said, but we have a lot of books by Plato in which there is a character named Socrates who says a lot of things. There are some people who think that these are just straight up like transcriptions of real conversations. I don't buy it. They don't sound like conversations. The general academic consensus is that there's probably like kernels of truth mixed in, that these are not like the court stenographer taking notes as Socrates just gives speeches. These are Plato as an author using Socrates as a character in a narrative. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think that, at least as I understand the consensus.
That's definitely what I think. And if it's what I think, it's the consensus.
Well, of course, yeah.
So you may be familiar with Plato's Republic. He's got a couple other books, but I would say not a couple. He's got a stack of other books, but that's like probably the most famous one. And he had a student named.
Aristotle.
Whoa. Tell me who Aristotle was in a single sentence.
I think Aristotle is sort of the forefather of what would become medieval philosophy, is how I think of him, which is much after his time, but he was the one who a disproportionate amount of work in at least medieval European, but also Middle Eastern philosophy was engaging with Aristotle specifically.
Various theologians from monotheistic religions sort of found ways to make his ideas hold hands with their belief systems. The main thing that you need to know just for this story is that Plato had a lot of ideas that Aristotle tweaked and, depending on who you ask, might have just outright disagreed with. There's this famous quote in a book by Aristotle called the Nicomachean Ethics. I am not going to get this quote verbatim correct, but he essentially says, like, Plato is our friend, but truth is our better friend. So we should care about what's true and not about what Plato says. But we do sort of have this lineage in which Socrates is like the great philosopher, the Elvis, who teaches Plato, and then Plato teaches Aristotle. Today, we're going to talk about like a different chain of disciples. So it goes Socrates, Antisthenes, and Diogenes. We're going to get into Antisthenes, but really quick, I just want to say the stuff in what are we calling the biographer? The big DL?
The big DL.
The stuff in the writing of the big DL is not like the level of verification and accuracy that you get in like most history textbooks. I mean, he was also an ancient Greek writer, so I approach it more similarly to like a work of literature than I would to like a history textbook written today. That doesn't necessarily bother me. Like when I'm reading the Gospel of John, I think Jesus probably didn't say all that stuff, but like I still think that the Gospel of John is interesting.
It's funny, I was going to say, I feel like in my head, if we're comparing it to the Gospels, I'd probably compare it more to Mark, although I'm not an expert on the age of the big DL's writing. But
That could be all well and true, but the simple matter of fact is Mark is not an interesting gospel.
Mark is such an interesting gospel.
Or like even like the Pali Canon, which is like the oldest Buddhist scripture, like Buddha did not say all that. And that's fine because it's a beautiful work of literature and I'm very comfortable approaching it that way. I just want a big disclaimer on the podcast. You should not take this as like verified historical fact. You should take this as like stuff some guy said about stuff that other guys might have said. So let's talk about the things that Antisthenes might have said. Any thoughts?
I thought that Antisthenes came off as interesting, not super distinctive from, a lot of what I've read of the, of like Plato, but I thought his emphasis on, the ascetic stuff was very interesting.
Can you define the word aesthetic for us?
Ascetic, not aesthetic.
Oh, well, I was kind of racking my brain being like, what aesthetic stuff?
No.
Can you define both of those words for us then, just so that we can all learn something, both aesthetic
Yeah.
and aesthetic?
Well, aesthetic is the study of or aesthetics is the study of what is beautiful, typically in art. And ascetic or asceticism is, I believe it translates a word for something like training and typically has the meaning of undertaking, some kind of, bodily deprivation or suffering with the goal of some kind of mental cultivation.
There was a real emphasis on living in a very like ascetic manner, in part because Athens had recently gotten out of a like gluttonous war in which they were trying to expand well beyond their means, and in which they lost terribly. And I think there was sort of an emphasis on self-reliance that was just generally in the culture because the empire had like basically fallen.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was a very chaotic time, to put it mildly.
And during that chaotic time, we meet Diogenes. So Diogenes was in exile. We're not really sure why. It might have had something to do with defacing the currency in the city where he was from, Sinope. Aaron, do you know where Sinope is today?
Nope.
It's in Turkey.
Huh.
So when we say ancient Greek, like that's not wrong, but I just want everyone to remember it's not like the borders of Greece have existed for thousands of years. Ancient Greece very much included parts of Turkey. So Turkey is a country today that shares a border with both Greece and Iran. And I just want to point out, fascinating to me that like Greece and the Middle East, which are like where so much religion and philosophy comes from, it's like fascinating to me that they're touching or almost touching anyways.
Yeah.
So Diogenes leaves Sinope and goes to Athens. We are mildly trained in philosophy, not super duper trained in history. So I don't want to go too much into like the experience of immigrants in ancient Athens because we will trip up. But I just want to point out that like Aristotle also not from Athens. So there are all of these people who are like curious about philosophy and arriving and becoming great in that field in the same way that I might go to Paris today if I wanted to study like really great cooking. Like people went to Athens specifically to study the art of philosophy. So Diogenes gets to Athens and he becomes a disciple of Antisthenes, despite Antisthenes seemingly not like wanting him there. And he takes asceticism to like a whole new extreme. So he is living in a tub, he's begging for food, he is masturbating in public. Aaron, you're the expert. Any thoughts on masturbation in public?
I generally don't approve, but different time, I guess.
So part of what's going on there with the masturbation is this philosophy of cynicism. So, cynics are people who believe that most conventions are kind of bullshit. You should be pragmatic, you should live in accord with nature, but societal ideas in general, they regard with suspicion and like outright contempt. Diogenes is mocking young men just throughout this story. He's calling grown men boys. He's like very derisive to the general public. And I think part of the masturbation in public thing is just showing that this person doesn't really give a shit about conventions or the rules. And it's also about just like being to the point, being direct, meeting needs as soon as they arise. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, that's his sort of stated reasoning is not primarily demonstrative, but is just like, yeah, it gets rid of sexual desire. And, wouldn't it be cool if I could satisfy hunger just by rubbing my belly? Which is certainly a certainly a chain of reasoning.
Well, because like I think part of it is just like the attitude of like, I'm going to solve this problem as fast as I possibly can with the
Mhm.
means available to me. Let's just do it. Which
Yeah.
we on this podcast formally condemn public masturbation, but like I will say it is broadly consistent with like the way that he says you should live your life and the things that
Yeah.
he says you should value.
Yeah. No,
Um,
it definitely
his
fits his schema.
He's really sassy. We're not gonna have time to, like, go over every single funny anecdote in the book. There's a lot of them, but I just picked out a couple. I think he's got, like, a real, like, sitcom character energy. So there's one that involves Diogenes watching someone try to shoot a bow and arrow. They're doing a really bad job. So Diogenes sits down right next to the target and says, "This way I won't be hit." It's got, like, big, like, cold open energy. Like, he does
Yeah.
that, and you almost expect, like, the theme song to start playing.
Yeah. Now I wonder what
Yeah.
the Diogenes theme song would sound like.
Probably like a guy masturbating.
Oh God.
Another very famous story involves Plato and a chicken. So this and all other quotes are from the Pamela Mensch translation, published by Oxford University Press. I'm just gonna read the quote in its entirety. When Plato had defined man as an animal with 2 legs and no feathers, and was applauded, Diogenes plucked the feathers from a cock, brought it to Plato's school, and said, "Here is Plato's man." So Plato is trying to define what humanity is. They're using man in a gender neutral way, ancient Greece. And just to be clear, when it says cock, they mean like a dead chicken. So Diogenes pulls the feathers from a dead chicken, he brings it to Plato's school and says, "Look, everybody, this is a thing that fits the definition of a man as given by Plato." Aaron, how does the big DL say that Plato fixed the definition? Do you remember?
Yeah, it's broad nails.
Which I think does eliminate the chicken problem, but I don't think it's a very good definition of humanity. I am going to be a little bit of a hypocrite. I know that I said that, like, doesn't really matter whether or not this stuff happened, but just for the record, no fucking way this happened. That is not the kind of stupid, silly thing Plato would say. Plato says many stupid, silly things. Being imprecise about a definition is not one of them. I also, it's just like, where is this homeless guy getting a chicken from? It boggles the mind. So I have a slightly darker story next. It is alleged that Diogenes was sold into slavery. This was a very, very, very common practice in the ancient Greek world. I obviously, just for the record, we on this podcast formally condemn slavery. We are very brave. So Diogenes gets sold into slavery. We don't really know how this came about. The text is unclear and gives multiple versions of the same story, but I think he might have been like kidnapped by pirates, which was a pretty common way to wind up a slave in the ancient Greek world. So he gets sold. What does he say that he's good at?
At ruling over men.
Which is like ballsy. I will say it's maybe like not as absurd as it might seem today. Ancient Greek slavery was different in a lot of ways from the transatlantic slave trade that happened in the United States. There were enslaved people employed as bankers and coin testers. My source for that is chapter 11 of Slavery and Honor in the Ancient Greek World. So Diogenes is making a joke there, but it's just like not as much as you might think. Just based on the Diogenes Laertius text, we don't really know how Diogenes of Sinope got out of slavery, but I think it goes to show like how sassy he was that this person is like in a life and death situation and he's telling quips.
Yeah, I think it's also, I mean, it is, with, some humor, but also is making a point about what he sees as the, prerogative of a sage, of essentially that he knows how to live. And so that that I think there also is like, sincerity in him saying that is the service which he would be best at providing.
One thing that always struck me when I was reading this story is like, I'm never entirely sure whether the character of Diogenes knows that he's funny. There's another narrative later in the biography where a young man is giving a speech. Diogenes just starts eating beans that he had carried around with his robe. And I'm not an expert on clothing from the period, but I don't think that they had pockets. So he just had like beans cupped in his little tunic and was just munching on them. And he says that he's surprised when everyone looks away from the speaker. Another thing that like I just don't think that happened. That's so weird. But like just investing in the world of the story for a second. Does the character think that he's doing a bit? Or does he like not realize that this is a strange behavior?
No, I
Like
think
I'm never quite sure.
I think he's trying to illustrate how little people actually care about the speech.
It's tough because we don't know what this speech was about. We don't know if Diogenes thought it was any good. I think there's a case to be made that he's being like, well, this young man is praising accord with nature. And if you were real men, you would not have been distracted because you would have been so awed by the majesty of this speech. Something like that. But just across the board, I lean towards thinking that he's in on the joke.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that he's often, performing. I mean, Plato sort of, calls him out a few times for it. Notably, the story where he's getting splashed with water, and then when the people are looking on and pitying him, Plato basically says, if you want to spare him, go somewhere else, stop watching.
So, how is Diogenes supposed to have died?
Well, it gives a few possibilities. Getting sick from eating an octopus is one. Getting bitten by a dog while feeding dogs an octopus is another. And another is that he just deliberately stopped breathing to die.
I'm pretty sure that last one is like physiologically impossible. I don't think you can commit suicide by holding your breath.
I'm not
But
sure.
the other two, which of the other two do you think is more likely to happen to the two of us? Dying by poisoned octopus or getting bitten by a dog while feeding octopus to a different dog?
Um, I feel like, food safety being the way it is, probably the bitten by a dog one.
I was gonna say just poisoned octopus. Like, I feel like any octopus you eat has to be a little bit poisoned.
I don't think that's true, but,
I think that's a rule written by the FDA.
wow. It has to have at least trace amounts of cyanide in it, or of cholera in this
Yeah, and
case.
I think there's minimum thresholds. I don't think it's just trace amounts. I think it
Yeah.
has to be, like, above a certain metric.
Wow.
It's crazy what they're doing in this society.
It really is.
So, none of Diogenes' writings survived, but we do have a list of titles that the big DL attributes to Diogenes. There is all sorts of debate among classicists about whether or not any of these texts actually existed, and if they did, was it really Diogenes of Sinope who wrote them? Was it a different Diogenes? Was it somebody else entirely? We're not going to get into that here, but I did just want to point out two titles. He is supposed to have written a book called The Republic, not Plato's Republic, a different
Mhm.
republic. And it's worth noting that this is like something that ancient Greek philosophers did. Plato has a symposium, and Xenophon also has a book called Symposium. At a certain point, you should regard these like shared titles kind of as like genres, like a sonnet, like, oh, Diogenes wrote his Republic.
Mhm.
Shakespeare wrote his sonnet. Is
Mhm.
that fair?
I think so.
And then he's supposed to have written a text called The Oedipus, which was a tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would be curious. I thought it was interesting that he had composed a few tragedies. I did not know that before, or supposedly composed a few tragedies. And I did not know that
Yeah.
he was associated with that before reading this.
So the big DL doesn't lay out like Diogenes's systematic philosophy in the way that you might see in like Nicomachean Ethics written by Aristotle, but we see the broad strokes of a belief system. So I think one of the big tenets is to live happily, you should live in keeping with nature. Another thing that jumped out at me, when Diogenes was asked what is the most beautiful thing in the world, he replies, freedom of speech.
Yeah, I know I thought that was interesting.
It reminds me a lot of the fate of Socrates, who was ordered to commit suicide because he was corrupting the youth, which is basically a fancy way of saying he was introducing 17-year-olds to strange religious ideas that would later become like the philosophy of Platonism. Also jumps out at me because it's like so counter to what is said in Plato's Republic. Uh, so we're not going to do a whole podcast about the Republic this time around. I will say I do think for most of what is in that book, you got to imagine that Plato had a shit-eating grin when he wrote it. But just for the record, he does say we got to exile all the poets. I studied creative writing, and I can tell you that he was correct about that. But it does run counter to the idea that like freedom of speech is the most beautiful thing in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how much, because how recent Socrates had been killed, but there's, always a possibility that was sort of the implicit critique too,
Implicit critique
of just the lack of it.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Another item on the Diogenes belief system checklist, just something that jumped out at me. He says, even if I do pretend to have wisdom, that in itself is philosophy. Which, again, jumps out at me just because Plato is like so concerned with appearance and how all appearances should be treated as false and how truth matters more than appearance. It's just interesting that like pretending is treated as like a legitimate activity in Diogenes's worldview.
Well, I don't know how much is that it's legitimate and how much is just that, like, to pretend to have something like wisdom, you have to construct an idea and a model of wisdom, you know?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Do you want to go to our next segment?
Sure. Welcome to the Afterlife, the part of the show where we see how our reading was brought back to life in another culture or medium. Today we're talking about Diogenes posting, which Know Your Meme describes as the practice of posting green text stories and memes about ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes, often presenting him as the original shit poster and a troll.
So we have an example of Diogenes posting that describes Aaron and I. It is an image of Diogenes in his tub with the following descriptions. Me, naked chronic masturbating alpha standing up to the man. You, closet homosexual overrated as fuck beta.
Yep. I've always been told I'm like Alexander the Great.
We didn't talk about him at all in this episode. You can't bring him up like an hour in.
Well, technically we did.
I just think it's fascinating to me that like Diogenes is the one who became a meme. So I can think of other Greek writers who were funny, Aristophanes. I even think Plato has some hysterical moments here and there. I can also think of other philosophers in general who were funny, Voltaire, for example. Why do you think it is that Diogenes gets the meme treatment?
I think it's that, broadly speaking, I feel like most philosophers and their model of like what, virtue is and stuff tend towards something that is broadly agreed upon, that it's like, they might have more rigorous reasoning and might, differ or make it, more demanding or even sometimes less demanding. But in general, when philosophers, talk about things that are good, either you can be like, oh, that made sense in the context of then, or it makes sense now, even if their arguments seem strange. Whereas Diogenes, what he proposes is still would be very controversial if you put it into practice. So I suspect that that's why.
I also think that there's like a lot of tension between the ideas of Diogenes and the ideas of Plato, even though they're sort of both on the family tree of discipleship. There's all of this conflict, there's all of this sass between them. And I do think that, like, broadly speaking, Plato won. We live in a world that was shaped by the ideas of Plato, like it or not. Christianity, in my opinion, is just Plato with all the interesting parts vacuumed out, and Christianity has conquered most of the planet, unfortunately. So I do wonder if part of Diogenes's popularity is he was, as this meme says, standing up to the man. And the man is sort of still in power today.
Isn't Christianity only the second most practiced religion?
What's the most?
I don't know. I don't think it's Christianity. In fact,
It's definitely
you
Christianity.
sure?
So according to the Pew Research Center, this is a 2020 study that says Christians are the largest religious group. They make up 2.3 billion people compared to the second largest group, Muslims, at only 2 billion.
Huh.
Sorry, 2.3 billion for Christians. How this is great. Aaron, you once tried to convert me to Christianity by pointing out that it's the world's largest religion.
Really, that seems like a bad argument.
Yeah, it did.
Are you sure I wasn't saying something about like, uh the the probability of like surviving from the, you know,
Well, I think your point was basically like you would be saying that the largest chunk of humanity is wrong.
oh, that's interesting. I thought it was
Did you think it was Buddhism?
No, I did not think it was Buddhism.
Okay, just checking. Just checking, kiddo. So what are we reading next time?
Wait, what are we reading next?
The Jemisin.
Okay, I
I
had a
should
moment.
I should have put this in the outline.
I had a
here.
moment.
So what are we reading next time?
We are reading two sci-fi short stories by N.K. Jemisin called Henosis and the Valedictorian.
We are not exactly sure when you're going to hear from us again, but you definitely will hear from us again. Thanks for listening. Aaron, you got to say bye.
Oh, thanks for listening. And yeah, bye.
Bye.